Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, December 28th, 2020. First of all, another Merry Christmas. I hope you had a happy, healthy, safe, wonderful holiday and a few days off like I took as well. I'm glad you're here with me to get back to it. Today, I want to talk about, I guess we can call him the big guy, Alexander Hamilton. And the reason I call him that is because there's probably no founder, and this is not a positive thing either. There's no founder whose views are used to support the monster state today more than Alexander Hamilton. We live under the largest government in the history of the world, and Hamilton's views tend to be most prominent. But he was a notorious flip-flopper, arguing for one thing during the ratification debates, before ratification, and then another one. I mean, you could even say he's flip and flop, and then another direction even after that. But after ratification, he totally changed his tune on a number of things. So on this episode, I want to explore a question that comes up quite a bit. And in essence, we could say, should we cancel Alexander Hamilton? On what we generally have two camps on this. When we hear from supporters of the original legal meaning of the Constitution, supporters of our work, we either hear, oh, you got to talk totally about Hamilton because the Supreme Court cites him. He was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. And then on the other hand, we hear from people like, just ignore him. Don't hear anything. Don't talk about him. Don't cite him, etc. So I've got some notes and thoughts, just some random post-Christmas thoughts and notes on Alexander Hamilton and the state of government today, and I'm just going to run through them and see where it takes us. I hope you'll find it interesting. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program, all of the archives for over 2.5 years. On individual episodes, I'll include links to articles, original source documents, other episodes, stuff so you can read, watch, listen, and learn more on your own time, because I'm really just scratching the surface, and I cite a lot of great articles that you can read more at a different time as well. I also have all the platforms that we're on. For example, the live streaming, YouTube, Facebook, DLive, Twitter, and elsewhere. We have archive video platforms like Library, LBRY, Library.tv. It's decentralized and censorship resistant. We also have all the podcast platforms, Apple, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Amazon, and the rest. All that and more, including our membership program where you can support us for as little as $2 a month. We make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And while we take a few more moments to allow people to get notifications so they can join us on the live stream, I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I apologize if I miss anyone, but I'm just going to scroll through here in my chat app and see what I can find. Blue North Wind, Bob Landry, Lawrence Smith. I saw Funky Euphemism earlier. He said he couldn't join us during the live broadcast, but wanted to point out Aaron Burr, James S., Grant Sundberg. Good to see you, buddy. Appreciate your support. Justin Morrison, Walter, Tyler B. Hope you're doing better. Dixie Strong, MRGF, Walter Henry Jefferson, Brian Alanis, Alexander Helling, thanks for being here as well. Cole Cochran, John Bush, I love you as well, man. I really enjoyed your show on Freedom Cells that you did last week as well, man. I really appreciate the work that you're doing for decentralization as a tool to advance liberty. John Bush is a guy you guys want to follow as well. Dennis Barberger, good to see you as well. and everyone else. I apologize if I miss anyone, but I really, really appreciate you being here, whether it's your first time here or you've been here every day since day one. So let's talk about Alexander Hamilton. He was a horrible flip-flopper. I've already pointed out that so many of the things that he advocated for are what are part of the monster state, the largest government in the history of the planet, the largest empire in the history of the world. We can trace back its lineage to the views, the policies, a lot of the things that Alexander Hamilton had to say a little bit later on after ratification of the Constitution. But he took a he was back and forth. He was all over the place, really notorious on his flip-flopping. For example, here from an article by Dave Benner covering Brian McClanahan's great book on Alexander Hamilton, he put it this way. On June 18th, and most people don't even know this, June 18th of the Philadelphia Convention of 1787, Hamilton infamously proposed a highly nationalistic form of government, really centralized in power, far more than what they passed, where the executive was something of an elected monarch that served for life. And if you look at the ratification debates in the states, you hear a lot of people talking about, well, we don't want this consolidation that will lead to a monarchy. James Madison, in his Virginia Resolutions of 1798 against the Alien and Sedition Acts, pointed this out as well. His report of 1800 pointed out that really no one was concerned, no one really was on board with consolidation that would lead to a kind of a monarchy, whether an elected king that switched around or just the institution. There was an outlier who really loved that kind of stuff, and we're talking about him today, and that's Hamilton. So he wanted the executive to essentially be an elected monarch that served for life. He wanted all states to be essentially consolidated into one political unit, and the executive would appoint the senators and state governors. So they would really just be tools, they would be appointees of this elected centralized monarch. Hamilton's proposal, Dave writes, was so unpopular in Philadelphia. It was very unpopular. He was really just kind of, well, he was just out there, that it was practically ignored. And Dave writes that Hamilton himself admitted that the plan was, quote, very remote from the rest of the delegates. So even he knew that what he was pushing for was not something that people in Philadelphia wanted. It certainly wasn't what the people who were trying to consider whether or not to support the Constitution, to ratify it, would be on board with. Now, 1 year later, at the Poughkeepsie Convention in New York, he was singing a different tune. First of all, he wanted an elected monarch in Philadelphia. Those were in secret, really. No one really knew who was doing what. But at the Poughkeepsie Convention in New York, which was considering it for ratification, this is the summer of 1788, Hamilton had decided that the new framework was worth fighting for. All of a sudden, he was fully on board with this. And on the convention floor, he promised that the primacy of the states was an essential feature of the new model. He just wanted the states. He originally wanted the states really just to have governors that were appointed by an elected monarch. And now all of a sudden, he's trying to sell it for ratification. He's telling everybody, oh, really, the states are really, this federal system is really what's prime here. And the central government isn't going to have all that much power. And here's how he put it. The natural strength and resources of the state governments, Hamilton said, would give them an important supremacy over the general government. Doesn't sound like what we live under today, does it? Hamilton, Dave writes, went as far as to explicitly declare at various points, he said this over and over and over again, that the new general government could exercise only powers that were, and he used these words, expressly delegated, and assured skeptical opponents that states remain supreme in their proper and retained sphere of power. Again, this is from Dave Benner's great overview. We published it about 3.5 years ago, an overview of Brian McClanahan's book on Alexander Hamilton, which we'll get to more in a moment. And Dave points out that Hamilton even doubled down on this pledge by promising that laws contrary to the Constitution, which did not meet the litmus test of enumeration, would be null and void. That was in Federalist number 78. He used the phrase null. They would be void. But he was busted, really, at that particular convention. People knew, not a lot of people, but some people knew who were inside. They knew what kind of guy Alexander Hamilton was. And one of them was John Lansing. I've cited him from time to time. He was a leading anti-federalist. I think he's very important for us to understand his views. You have to really understand all sides of the equation. And maybe you know where I'm going with this then, as far as Hamilton as well. But Lansing warned the skeptical masses that Hamilton's words seemed duplicitous, according to Benner, noting that he had favored a highly centralized nationalist government in the Philadelphia Convention. Couldn't keep that secret, could he? Now, some people might say, well, flip-flopping is okay from time to time. Flip-flopping is bad. James Madison, for example, he was a huge flip-flopper, at least at one point, because before the Philadelphia Convention, like Madison, he wanted an even more centralized system. So, of course, they consolidated a bit more versus the Articles of Confederation. I'm not going to get into the details of that right now, whether that's good or bad or what the motivation's for, any of that. But the fact of the matter is that Hamilton also wanted a very nationalist type of government. He wanted massive centralized power. He wanted the federal government to have a veto power over all acts of the state legislatures. This was something called the Virginia Plan. But after ratification, he flip-flopped. And he decided to take kind of a 10th Amendment, a federalism approach, and he was pretty consistent with that over time. I did an episode on this a couple of months ago. Madison and Hamilton, A Tale of Two Flip-Flops. I have it up on the screen if you guys are watching video, but I will link to that in the show notes. I encourage you to check it out a little bit later on, understanding the difference of what I actually personally consider to be a good flip-flop versus an opportunist one. I think you won't be surprised as to who is who on that one. Now, I think in some ways, changing your mind and learning things over time is an admirable trait. So I don't know what Madison's motivations were. Maybe he wanted something more than he got. He recognized that he didn't. There was a consensus to get less than what he was actually pushing for. And he said, you know what? This is what I was okay with, so I'm going to be on board with going with this going forward. Hamilton did not do that. He actually took one position, and then he didn't get what he wanted, so then he just tried to change things later on after ratification. And that's what government does. And we should actually acknowledge the old axiom that power corrupts, power always seeks to expand. And so once you give them power, you know that bad dudes are going to come in there and try to use that power and build precedent upon precedent upon precedent and expand it over time. So Madison may have not gotten what he wanted. Maybe someone convinced him. Either way, he changed his mind, he changed his approach, and he was very consistent after that. Even if he wasn't necessarily the best guy or the worst guy, whatever, I think that in and of itself is admirable. You don't have to hold to a position just because you took it. I've changed my mind on tons of stuff. I might even change it as I go through these notes here as well. So anyways, more on Hamilton. Here's Brian McClanahan as well from an article we published back in 2017. It was originally at LouRockwell.com. Hamilton argued in Federalist number 69 that the American presidency would not resemble a king, only to push for executive powers while Secretary of Treasury that George III would have recognized. So on the one hand, in the Federalist Papers, when he was arguing for ratification, and I'll talk about Federalist a little bit more in a bit, but the Federalist Papers were primarily for a New York audience. We give them so much weight today. Everybody's like, you hear people who tell us that, whether it's a legal scholar, the federal court system, politicians, bureaucrats, writers, etc., we hear so much about the Federalist Papers. But the Federalist Papers weren't really widely read. They were almost entirely made as a marketing tool to convince people in New York who were very likely to reject ratification under Governor Clinton and others, John Lansing and others, Melancton Smith, were opposing this very strongly. It was primarily written to actually support ratification in New York. So it didn't actually affect the views of the people of the several states all that much. I mean, they were published and printed and read elsewhere, but not very widely at all until later on. So to me, that's actually fascinating. I guess it shouldn't be surprising because a lot of what Hamilton had to say later on certainly was for bigger and bigger government. So of course you'd want to, for those of you who want to actually support larger government, he's going to be your guy, even when he's saying things that are different, because you can say, well, maybe he didn't really mean it or something. I'm not sure how they get from point A to point B. But in Federalist 69, he said specifically the American presidency would not resemble a king. Certainly we live under some kind of an elected monarch today, even if it changes. An elective despotism is not the one we fought for. Choosing your monarch, choosing your king every few years is not the definition of freedom, of course. Here's a little bit more from Brian as well. Hamilton proposed in Federalist 21 that indirect taxes, meaning tariffs, should be used more extensively than direct taxes, because direct taxes created substantial problems for an economy. So at the time where he knew that the ratification was fragile, he's actually using a message like a lot of narcissist sociopaths, and I think Brian called him that at one point, and I think you guys know where I'm going as well. But like a lot of sociopaths, they'll change the message. They'll read the crowd. They know what the crowd wants to hear. They'll tell them what they want to hear, whether they mean it or not, because all they care about is the end goal. So he just wanted to make sure that, I think he just wanted to make sure that ratification would happen, and the things that he didn't like that were restrictive on the federal government, he would work to undermine those things later on. I sense that as a motive all along. And so he pointed out in Federalist 21 during the ratification debates that a direct tax, like an income tax, for example, because the modern income tax is a direct tax, would be problematic for an economy. And here's how Brian put it: except we shouldn't listen to Hamilton. He didn't mean it. Less than 3 years after writing Federalist 21, Hamilton turned around and argued for, drumroll, a lengthy list of direct taxes, ostensibly because the country supposedly needed it. But Hamilton even suggested at that time that such taxes would only be used in a time of war. But the United States was not at war in 1790. It got pretty close because of something we all know as the whiskey tax, the whiskey rebellion. This is one of my favorite of my history episodes. It was back in July, George Washington and the whiskey rebellion. The story is far different than what most people want you to believe today, but in there I actually covered some of the scammy nature of Alexander Hamilton. He basically was selling people on being on board, primary stakeholders, people who could be very influential on whether or not this thing was going to get passed. He took a totally different reason as to why the whiskey tax was important to one group and then to another and then to another. I covered that briefly in that episode as well, and it just is another example of how he was kind of a snake oil salesman in my view. But I encourage you to check out that episode. It's really interesting history stuff. Going further, this is how Benner put it. Oh, actually, before getting to that, I want to point out some of the other really bad flip-flops that we got from Hamilton. For example, on the necessary and proper clause. He actually took a total different view on the general welfare clause, the necessary and proper clause, and these led to before ratification and then after. And we got things from that like the National Bank. And I think the National Bank and now the Federal Reserve today is enough on its own to be like, this is not a good guy. Especially because he said one thing specifically earlier on. He and Madison talked about how they absolutely would not authorize the federal government to charter a bank, for example. And then later on, of course, he makes an excuse as to why he can do that. So quite a bit of what makes up the monster state today, if we're talking about expansive views of general welfare, necessary and proper, and then of course the engine that funds the most powerful government in the history of the world, the Federal Reserve, the central bank, the National Bank, can be traced back directly to a lineage of Alexander Hamilton. And here's what Benner had to say as well, talking about Brian McClanahan's book, How Alexander Hamilton Screwed Up America. McClanahan even delves into Hamilton's influence during the last century, because it wasn't just right off the bat. And we know that every expansion of power becomes a new baseline. So if you start out with just giving them 1 out of 100 in power, then the next people are going to come in and raise it to 2 and 3 and 5 and 10 and 11. And it may be slow, it may be fast, but over time, all of a sudden you're like, well, this power goes to 11. And I said that the max was going to be 10. How did we get here? You have to look at each tiny precedent. Back in 1767, John Dickinson pointed out that slavery ever begins from sleep, and he was tying this into the notion of precedent. As soon as you give someone precedent to take money, to raise money, to do things without the proper authorization because of an emergency or for whatever reason, because you think the end results at the time are good, then eventually that's what destroys liberty right there, even if it hasn't been destroyed at that time, because you've set the foundation for people in the future to do it. And McClanahan in his book talks about how this has played out in more modern times, especially with the judiciary. And here from Wikipedia, they talk about this as well. Hamilton's policies, they write, as Secretary of the Treasury. This is, again, after ratification. It greatly affected the U.S. government and still continues to influence it. his constitutional interpretation, specifically of the necessary and proper clause. He basically took a view that everything is necessary, that there are implied powers, even when earlier on during the ratification debates, he said there's no implied powers. Necessary and proper, which I've covered elsewhere, means something very specific. It's not whatever the government thinks is necessary to do what it wants to do. It is a very specific legal meaning, and it had that at that time. And of course, he took advantage of the notion that he could get away with a little bit, and expand from there. So specifically, even in Wikipedia, this is very mainstream, Hamilton's views of the necessary and proper clause set precedent for federal authority that's still used by the courts and are considered an authority on constitutional interpretation. Why is Hamilton considered the authority on the necessary and proper clause? Because he was the guy who helped establish the precedent right off the bat. And we're primarily talking about, in this situation, not necessarily the whiskey tax, but when it comes to the necessary and proper clause, these were his arguments for implied power for the federal government to establish the first bank of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, in response, even though he lost that argument, and we're paying the price for him losing that argument still today, he told us that to take a single step beyond the bounds of the Constitution, take one single step, is to take a field of a boundless list of power. Basically, setting that precedent today means they have unlimited power somewhere down the line. Now, he does absolutely, of course, he absolutely has a lot of influence on the courts. And we see the courts citing the Federalist Papers. And I mentioned that briefly before, but the Federalist Papers again, and I really need to hammer this home. The Federalist Papers have an outsized influence on what goes on in government and politics today. Again, these were a series of marketing papers. I mean, certainly there's a lot of important stuff in there, and you can understand what James Madison, the supposed father of the Constitution, had to say, John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and Alexander Hamilton, who was George Washington's basically his chief of staff during the Revolutionary War. He was a really important figure of the time. This is Washington's guy. Everybody loved Washington, even the people who didn't like Washington. Still, Washington was really revered at the time. So Hamilton was his guy. So everybody's like, well, okay, at least we should listen to him, even when he sounds kind of like a bit of a wackadoo. But the Federalist Papers today have an outsized influence compared to what they had at the time. Now, we know obviously that Alexander himself wasn't in charge. Alexander Hamilton wasn't the guy who was running things. He wasn't the elected monarch. He wasn't the king. I mean, we can look at George Washington as being a problem on that too, because he was helping implement what Hamilton had to say. Hamilton was the man with the plan. He was extremely influential at the time, and we know he's been influential since then. But it's the people, it's the human action, the people who put his views into practice at the time, and the people who have expanded on those views, precedent after precedent after precedent, who really are the biggest problem. But it is, of course, important to actually understand where they get their viewpoints from. And you can see this image here that I've pulled up on the screen. It was from a speech in the New York Ratifying Convention of June 28, 1788. Here he is saying, whatever is not expressly given to the federal head is reserved to the members. He sounds like a 10th Amendment supporter. And Mike Meharry, in an article some time ago, he said, at the time, during the ratification debates, Alexander Hamilton sounded as Madisonian as James Madison. But because so much of what we wrongly live under today can be traced back to Hamilton, I think it's really common for supporters of our work, supporters of the original legal meaning of the Constitution, supporters of liberty just in general. Anytime we share an image like this that's up on the screen that's actually correct, anytime we share that, we'll hear things like, don't share that. What are you guys doing? He's one of the bad guys. You don't want to give him voice. This is not good news. And we'll often even hear the same type of thing about other founders. Hamilton was not the only one. We can't have this level of reverence that founders, like all people, good and bad, but they're still human beings. There were a lot of other people who wanted a big central government, kind of like an elected monarchy, similar to Alexander Hamilton. There's Governor Morris in New York, Fisher Ames in Massachusetts, who I cite pretty regularly, and James Wilson as well. And I did an episode on James Wilson. James Wilson was also one of the first Chief Justices of the Supreme Court, but he was actually far more influential on the original understanding, how the people viewed the document while they were considering it for ratification, than Hamilton was. And I actually covered that in an episode back in October, History Ignored, James Wilson's speech on the Constitution. I really encourage you to check that one out. That's much shorter than my ramblings today. It's probably about 15 minutes or so. And that was his famous State House Yard speech. We know that it was immediately republished, reprinted all throughout the colonies at the time, or throughout the states at that time. Not colonies, wow, my history is bad there. But it was published all over the place. People widely read it. He made a lot of explanations about important parts of the Constitution. And when people were considering it for ratification, he had far more influence. This didn't happen with Hamilton until later on. Going further, I think in essence what we're dealing with here, when people tell us don't share things about Morris or Wilson or Hamilton or any of these people because they aren't on our side. And in essence, I would say most of them, other than Hamilton, really were far better than anything we live under today. So even the big government people at the time, the government of today is so much larger and has so much more power. Maybe that's what Hamilton wanted for a very long-term vision. I can't actually say that. People like Benner, McClanahan, Kevin Gutzman, and others would probably be far better at actually knowing that part of history. I don't know what his long-term motivation was. But I do know that he was really scamming and changing his views in order to get more power in the central government. But I can't even count the number of times that people have come to us and told us to not share quotes or images or articles about Thomas Jefferson, or basically any founder for that matter, because of slavery. And that's a horrible monstrosity of an institution. But I'm not a fan of straw man arguments, and we're not here to attack the individuals. Of course, if we want to do well, I'm attacking Alexander Hamilton right now, because if we're doing an expose on what we need to talk about, of course, if we're doing an expose on an individual, we certainly should talk about some of the negatives as well. I don't do that enough. When I find someone that I like their views, I tend to highlight the positives, and I really actually need to spend more time being more balanced and showing, well, this is what they did as well, and this is garbage. So straw man arguments are a real problem. All of the founders, like all of us, you and I, we're all flawed human beings. We've made massive mistakes all throughout our lives. What we need to do is learn from them and be better people. I used to be a pretty homophobic, racist piece of garbage. I was openly telling people I was a communist. I mean, that's a death cult. I don't think I was a really great person. I'm still working to improve myself today. I think I was better. I'm better than I was. But if you focus on the person rather than the message, you're basically going to find over time that every single person in history needs to be ignored for some reason or another, depending on who's telling you to do the ignoring. And I think Samuel Adams had something really great to say about this. Let me pull Adams up here. He put it this way: it's a very great mistake to imagine that the object of loyalty is the authority and interest of one individual man, however dignified by the applause or enriched by the success of popular actions. What should our loyalty be towards? Should our loyalty be towards an individual or a political party or a document? Absolutely not. None of it. Adams went further. He put it this way: true loyalty is founded in the love and possession of liberty. So we don't have an allegiance to a person. We don't have an allegiance to anything. We have an allegiance to liberty. That's our true loyalty according to the father of the American Revolution. I absolutely agree with that. In short, we know the old phrase: the remedy for bad speech, the remedy for lies is not to silence it, but with truth and more speech to counter it. And of course, even more important than that, we're doing constitutional education. So if you want to understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution, this is an interesting quote I pulled up here as well. This is from an old article, like 2008 or so. In my early days of writing, I'm not a great writer, but I certainly wasn't good back then. But I had this great quote from a guy named Peter. I've never been able to figure out who this is. I think he changed his email address. I've reached out and gotten bounced back. But this was a great email that I got from him. So motivational for me personally. He said, "Truth may not be forceful, but it can heal. It can even repair a broken world. Truth poses no threat to anyone save those who rely on untruth as the cornerstone of their foundations. It is time to speak the truth, irrespective of who is listening or even has the ears to hear. So I really took that to heart. I knew I was only reaching a handful of people at that time. I'm still reaching small numbers compared to what I would love to do today, but I'm grateful for you to be here to listen to what my own truth is, what is important to me, what I feel is important to share, and I'm going to continue doing that no matter what. Truth is what breaks through the lies eventually, and we need to spread more and more truth. But if we're talking about learning the Constitution itself, I did an episode on this over the summer, Constitution Research Guide, how to read an 18th century legal document. If we want to know the meaning of any phrase, any word, anything in the Constitution itself, you have to understand how the people who gave it legal force understood it. That is, the people of the several states in their ratifying conventions. And the way you understand that, the way you actually get to the bottom of that, is through dictionaries of the time, through papers, through speeches, through documents, through debates in the state ratifying convention on all sides. So if you only listen to the Federalist Papers, so my view is it's kind of a nuanced view when it comes to Hamilton, I guess. If you want to understand the legal meaning of the Constitution, Hamilton's views at the time of ratification have some degree of importance because it's primarily for New York. So if you want to understand how the people of New York understood it, you certainly want to look to Hamilton, Madison, and Jay in the Federalist Papers and the opposing arguments, and you kind of weave that together. You use a dictionary of the time to understand the words they were using. You read all the sides, the arguments, the ratification debates, and that's very important. But it shouldn't have an outsized influence and be cited all the time as the authority. The Federalist Papers citing it as the authority on the legal meaning of the Constitution means you're missing a vast majority of the discussions that were going on, putting too much weight on one thing. And of course, the heavy weight that they put on one thing, the Federalist Papers, includes the guy who wanted the biggest government of anybody at the time. Maybe Morris wanted one that was a little bit larger, but it's all degrees. He was the big government guy. So we don't want to do that. We want to understand where it's coming from and understand that overall balance. But like Brian McClanahan said earlier on in the show, or at least what I read from him, he basically says we shouldn't listen to him as well. And there's a reason to not listen. The reason is because if you listen to one thing and you're only listening to his later views, the views that are used by the Supreme Court, you're getting views that were seen as an outlier at the time of ratification. So when the people were actually drafting the document in the Philadelphia Convention, if you listen to Hamilton's views at that time, he was definitely outside of the mainstream. So he really wasn't the consensus. And then if you listen to him at the ratification debates, he's supporting what Madison and many others were having to say. That adds a little bit more importance to him. But then later on, when he changes those words and he specifically does things rejecting his earlier views on things like the General Welfare Clause, Necessary and Proper Clause, and others, then if you reject that, or if you listen to that now, then you're actually getting the wrong view. So we have to do a little bit of listening. We have to understand perspective and time, and we have to do a little bit of rejecting. So I don't know. It's a little bit of a gray area. I'm curious what you think. Do we totally ignore the guy? I think that's a bad idea to totally ignore him. And I also think it's a bad idea to totally ignore the later views as well, because then without understanding those, we can't understand how they're getting to the point, how they're explaining their power grabs today. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. This is really just kind of a rant of mine on whether or not we should cancel founders, because it's something that I hear from people, friends and enemies alike, all the time. I'm curious what you think about Hamilton or other founders. The real issue is you're always going to find something bad about every single one of them. None of them were saints. We're all very fallible human beings. Anyways, I want to take a quick look in the live chat. Another shout out to Vice President Aaron Burr for ridding us of the monarchist scum. John Adams was also a monarchist later on in life, and I think that might be a really good example. I did an episode about how Adams went from the Atlas of Independence in 1775 and 1776, talking about even earlier on how principle is more important than party, to later on becoming a monarchist. Mercy Otis Warren, in her great history of the American Revolution that Jefferson personally supported and gave out to his entire cabinet, his entire team, He thought this was so important. And she was like, he turned into something else. I think it's important when we look at these figures, or when figures become so popular that there's a musical play and they become mainstream, we have to be able to explain how they were inconsistent, how they were liars, how they were flip-floppers, and how they took one view versus another depending on whether or not they'd be able to gain more power. Steve Orcutt, Hamilton is a crook and a liar, and that's basically where Brian McClanahan takes it in his article. I think he's a little bit more balanced in his book, but you should read it on your own and check it out at your own time. But he basically takes that view as well. Hamilton was a liar. But again, I think the important thing to understand is when he was telling people that the federal government would only have expressly delegated powers, and then the people of New York actually voted in support of ratification under that type of understanding, then that understanding holds far more weight than what he says later on, that the federal government doesn't just have expressly delegated powers, it has all kinds of other implied powers, like establishing a central bank. Anyways, again, I hope you found this interesting. I hope it was educational, was entertaining to watch and listen to. It's a little bit more of a casual show than I normally do. I will continue reading the comments a little bit later on. I read them all. I don't get a chance to reply to many of them, but I get tons of great ideas and suggestions for future episodes. If you like what we're doing, you support the show, you support the TAC, you can do a few free and easy, fast things to help us spread the word. Most of the platforms, primarily the mainstream ones, have algorithms that are very easily triggered. If we're talking about cancel culture, let's talk about easily triggered as well. And when you do things like smashing the like button, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and any other podcast platform you're on, commenting, sharing the link, all of that stuff tells the platform to show the program to more people, and it's helping us reach and teach new people every single day. Thank you for doing that for us. And of course, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, our membership program starts out as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. $2 a month goes a long way to help us reach and teach people about the Constitution and liberty. Again, I hope you had a great Christmas. I hope you have a nice New Year plan coming up. I'll do a show on Wednesday. I might do another one, a bonus one over the weekend instead of New Year's Day on Friday, but we'll see how that plays out. I'll schedule it and give you guys updates as soon as I can. I appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.